Hey, welcome back to The Hard Pivot. I'm your host, Zach Roseman, the founder of Draftboard, and I am thrilled to be here today with someone who has an amazing story, actually two amazing stories. Nick Greenfield, the founder of Candid. Candid is, it would be insulting it to say it's a dental company. So I'll let him do more of the heavy lifting on what it is. But basically, they've revolutionized dental care and the whole dental care market for the consumer. He has a wild story starting out at Lyft before it was called Lyft. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that and then talk about the ups and downs of Candid and now backups, especially as it relates to COVID, which there's some like wild twists and turns that I only heard a little bit of, but he'll share more about that. So Nick, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Great to be here and excited to have some time to talk about pivoting, one of my favorite topics.
It's funny, like most founders would not say it's their favorite topic, but, like in the moment, it's not fun, right? Or depending on which moment. And then afterwards, if it went well, you're like, oh, that was fun.
Yeah, I think it depends what you're looking for. If you're in the search, if you're in search of greatness, then you have to pivot. Very, very often, you just keep doing what you're doing and you put your head down and then you run into a wall. And I think pivoting is a sign of keeping your eyes, on the horizon and seeing what's in front of you and seeing what the opportunity truly looks like. And if you're trying to build something great, then, usually there are twists and turns along the way. I've seen a couple companies who've been linear, but other than that, it's, there's everything great out there has to go through its moments of craziness and change.
It's funny because when I had the idea for this startup, I was like, oh, someone must have the idea for this pivot. Sorry, this podcast. Wow. End of the day here. I'm like all over the place. I was like, oh, someone must have like done a podcast just like this where they ask founders about pivots, because all we hear in startup world is everyone pivots. And then like I saw a couple people attempted it and it didn't go anywhere. It was just shocking to me. Like you said, there's just like everyone pivots. Could be a small pivot, could be a big pivot. Also, like what does the word pivot mean? I was just talking with the founder of Alma, Harry Ritter, and he was just like, I hate the word pivot. And he was just like, you always need to be reevaluating, and maybe it's a bigger, shift or a smaller shift, but you're starting from somewhere. Which I thought was interesting. He's like, rarely do you find a business that is like, oh, we did X and we throw out everything to do with X. We're doing something completely different that wasn't inspired by X, and we're doing Y instead. Usually there's at least some tether that connects them.
There's some level of understanding the word pivot that can be scary, but it also applies, especially as a founder, to everything that's going on in your company. I'll give you an example. In the case where, let's say you're a company going from 1 to 10 million and you have the right VP of sales to go from 1 to 10 million, but then you realize that that's not the right person, you need to make an adjustment to your strategy, which could include changing the person, surrounding that person with different people to support them, building up your RevOps function, for example. Yep. It could mean changing your go-to-market model, even if you're still selling the same product. So each kind of different element of your whatever you're doing needs to be evaluated on some cadence. And for me,
right, there's like constant pivots going on, but there are, and we'll hear it from you, moments when a company really takes a move in a totally different direction, or it feels like a totally different direction from the outside, even if, as I'm sure we'll hear from you, they were completely legitimate and logical, and it was almost like a thread that made sense internally about why you had to make the change. But there was something you said I wanted to something you said about, having a head of sales in the beginning that gets you to 10 million, and then, you change them or augment them or build their team up when you to go from 10 to 100. Someone once told me, and I'm curious what you think about this, that like, cause I think it's pretty mercenary, but maybe it's right, that when you're building a business, like head of sales is a great example, right? Like the person who gets you to 10 million very often cannot be the person who gets you from 10 to 100, because they have a completely different skill set. And that you should, in fact, you should assume that you're going to have to replace people every 18 to 24 months on your executive team. I thought that was kind of like, wow, that's either a really sober and just objective way to look at it, or a really like disappointing way to look at it. And is that a comment on the founder, or is that just a comment on that's just the reality of things?
I don't agree with that perspective. I think it's entirely situational.
Throw it out the window.
Yeah, look, I'll look at a company that I admire that's done incredibly well over the last 5 or 6 years, which is Ramp. And right. You look at their executive team, whether it's their CFO, the head of sales, the heads of different divisions, those have all been internal promotions. It's almost the opposite, which is
Right.
we've got someone really good who starts as an SDR, and that SDR becomes the VP of sales.
Yeah.
I think if you do a great job of hiring the right talent, you can actually bring people up in the organization rather than thinking about taking one person, this is the right person today, let's move them out and bring a new person in. I think hiring executives is much, much harder than developing talent and internally promoting, but it starts with how you do your kind of entry level junior hiring. And when a company is growing really quickly, being super intentional about that helps you build that talent bench. And you look at some of the top companies in Silicon Valley on the engineering side as well. These university hiring programs where you hire somebody out of Michigan or Illinois or MIT, and they come in, and then after 5 or 6 years, they're leading an entire department in engineering because you've been able to grow that talent. There's a talent component to that question, and then there's also a cultural component. And what you find many times, and our industry is a great example of that, if you're trying to build something that is, I don't love this term, but disruptive in nature, and you go out and you then recruit somebody who's either from industry or is not necessarily in line with the culture that you're trying to develop and build, they may have the skill set in theory in a different industry to go from, I would almost say 10 to 25 and then, or 10 to 30 and then 30 to 100 are different kind of different bars.
Right.
But
Different breakpoints.
You got to think about, does it make more sense to do this internally to promote someone, cultural continuity versus kind of net new talent? And again, it very depends on industry. So hiring executives, you got to be really good at hiring executives. And I think that's actually a founder skill set that is rare. I think it's really hard to find it. And so default.
And also in general, hiring is very difficult. I think everything I've read about this is there are like some super hirers, but they can't explain how they do it. And like, we haven't been able to figure out what they're looking for. And it's very rare that most people suck at hiring. Like it's just a hard thing. Not suck. It's hard to do. Anyways, we'll come back to all this like more philosophical stuff, but let's maybe just do an introduction of yourself, and then we'll start from the beginning. You'll take us back to the Lyft/Zimride days.
Yeah, I'll start there. I joined a company called Zimride out of college.
Where did you grow up? What did you do beforehand?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Maryland, and I went out to Stanford for college. It was during the financial crisis, and the school was going through, and everyone thinks about Stanford as a technology-oriented, Silicon Valley-focused school. But at the time, for folks who were not in engineering, people were going from a work standpoint pre-financial crisis, a lot of them into banking, consulting, pre-professional, graduate school. And the school really was going through a pretty big transformation where it wasn't just the engineers who were going into tech, it was everybody. And
right, like I was in college at the same time. I was also from the East Coast. And I remember thinking about applying to Stanford, and I was like, oh, great school. But like the association as like the place to go for startups, like wasn't in my head. Now, that's probably because the sort of Silicon Valley, just like everything about Silicon Valley that is now so culturally, relatable, or we all know about it, and its relationship with Stanford, which wasn't established yet on the East Coast, at least among high school students. And now it's like the total opposite.
People know what it is now.
Yes.
But at the time, and I didn't even know what a startup was. I mean, I didn't know what investment banking was when I got to college, and I probably didn't know what it was when I graduated college. I learned shortly thereafter when one of my good friends became an investment banker, what that meant. But we didn't have that when I got there. It was really again, during that financial crisis time, there was just this shift where you saw, my friends who went in thinking they were going to be mechanical engineering move to computer science. You saw jobs opening in places like Facebook and Google at the time, and Snap, which came shortly thereafter.
Right, they started hiring like first-year analyst classes the same way that Morgan Stanley and Goldman were doing.
Yes, and at jobs in sales and marketing and advertising, and then there were so many more. As venture was rebounding. As I graduated in 2011, venture was really rebounding, and it was the beginning of the Uber, Airbnb, DoorDash. Kind of all right around that time, these companies which were growing super quickly. And so they would go to Stanford and Berkeley and Santa Clara and San Jose,
hoovering up talent,
and Santa Cruz. And kids would want to stay in the Bay, would find jobs. So it became this place where you could graduate school, and there were lots of jobs that didn't really exist in other places, perhaps New York being an exception to that, but not necessarily in technology. Right. So I played ultimate in college, which was my kind of like my focus. I graduated college. I said, how do I keep playing, which is the equivalent of
How do
pro?
I become a professional ultimate frisbee player?
Yeah, which there really is now. I have a bunch of
Awesome.
friends who are kind of at the tail ends of their professional ultimate careers, and that's like their full-time job. I mean,
I love it.
they're making tens of thousands of dollars a year on it, which is enough. But at the time there wasn't pro, but there was the equivalent of pro was club. And the Bay Area, we had two teams. I was on the number 2 team, wasn't quite at the level of the number 1 team in the world, which is the San Francisco team. And we I was like, all right, well, I want to stay here. I got to find a job. And I happened to run into the founders of a company called Zimride. So John Zimmer was at a career fair and we hit it off. And he'd studied abroad in Sevilla and I'd studied abroad in Sevilla. And one thing led to another. And I got a job at this company called Zimride. And they've been around for 4 years. It was a ride sharing network to help connect passengers and drivers going on long distance trips. And think about almost like Airbnb for long distance kind of ride sharing. And
isn't there a business in France that started doing that did, like BlaBlaCar or something? I don't know how they're doing, but they grew pretty big, right?
Yeah, they're pretty big and it's pretty popular in Europe. But
Yeah.
socially, what we found in the US is it's much more challenging. Higher levels of car ownership, less kind of focus on the green idea, more fear of strangers. And we tried to build that business. It was originally actually a B2B business where we would sell systems to universities and corporations. So I started the first 6 weeks there. I was in enterprise sales. And then we had a company, a competitor called RideJoy. And I think this is going to be a theme that you will hear over and over again, where many what will end up being pivots, and spoiler alert, are driven by seeing.
Although I'll say there, people are listening to the hard pivot, so I think no spoilers.
Yeah, but are inspired by competitors. They're inspired by somebody who's in a space that's adjacent to you, where you go, wait a second, they're doing this. We should be doing this.
Right. So, or sometimes, and maybe not in your case, but I found oftentimes I'm inspired by something on the product or sales side, by something that's not even competitive to me, not even adjacent, but they have a similar model or there's something about it that I'm like, oh, it like ticks off something in my head. Oh, wait, we could do something like that.
The Uber for parking, right, is like the classic example there.
Right.
But we saw RideJoy, and RideJoy was a YC company. This is early YC days, and they were getting some traction with kind of doing these routes, the long distance routes from San Francisco to LA or from Vegas to San Diego, whatever it may be. And so I was the only person with bandwidth. There were 12 people at the company to go focus on the consumer side. So knowing nothing about it, I tried to figure out how do you build a marketplace, supply and demand. And it became one of the many businesses at the time that was built on the back of Craigslist. We, like others, figured out that you could, list things on Craigslist and pay $75 to have a listing and say, hey, drivers wanted, and people at the time, that was a go-to spot for basically anything. And you look, Airbnb was built on Craigslist. Zimride, Uber and Lyft ultimately were built on Craigslist. Originally, that was the best place to get kind of high levels of supply. And then ultimately, Craigslist had a rideshare section, and we then posted the demand. And so building a bunch of kind of bots to post on Craigslist. One thing led to another. We started building that out. It was kind of working. It wasn't working super well, but it was kind of working. And we started contracting with bus companies to list their seats as well. So creating kind of multiple nodes of supply for these routes, New York to DC, lots of buses going in that route, finding the bus companies and through API.
Were you at this point, it was pre the days of like a random guy just being like, I have a spot in my car? Was it like the Zimride service, not the bus part, but like, was it like a professional driver who was saying, I am willing to drive to LA?
It was more or less people who randomly discovered us, who discovered us through university networks, or who we found that were already listing on the Craigslist rideshare section.
Got it. So these were people who were already taking a trip. And it was like, hey, help me defray the cost, or I want someone to talk to, or something like that.
Yes. And the thesis at the time, and I'll come back to the importance of of a thesis in terms of making decisions around pivoting, but the thesis at the time was that long distance marketplace liquidity was where you would find the most supply and therefore the most demand because of the amount of flights and trips that were happening. So call it like late 2011 into kind of early 2012. And it was at this point, the company that gets very little to no credit for doing what they did, but was really the beginning of modern day Uber and Lyft launched, which was a company called Sidecar. And Sidecar was in San Francisco, the first peer-to-peer ride sharing network, which figured out very quickly.
And by the way, and this is when Uber has launched, but they're doing black car service in San Francisco, right?
Cars. That's right.
Yeah.
And I remember Troy Carter, who was an investor, he's famous for being Lady Gaga's manager and others' managers. He came to our office and talked to John, our founder, and John was like, "This Uber thing, like, it's more expensive than a cab. Why would you use it?" And he said, "Have you ever been a black guy in New York trying to get a cab?" And that was kind of an aha moment of the potential of something like an Uber to democratize being able to go from one place to the other. But Uber was more expensive, but the value prop with the black cars and the professional drivers was you press a button, somebody comes. And the iPhone enabled this to happen really around that time.
100%. Square started around the same time as a little attachment to your phone. Like there was so many things that the iPhone really enabled.
Yeah. And Sidecar comes in and they say, "Hey, we're going to use Craigslist to find drivers who want to make money, and we're going to build an app to help connect individual passengers with individual drivers. And we believe, our thesis is that short trips at lower prices than a taxi is really what the city of San Francisco needs." Because at the time, it was very hard to get a cab in San Francisco, and they were really expensive. Getting from North Beach to the Mission or North Beach to Soma was like a $25, $30 endeavor, and Sidecar was for $12.
Right. I assume it was similar to New York City, where you had medallions and you had vested interests who didn't want to issue new medallions, and it was a whole kind of guild system.
Yes, that's right. And lots of things, going on. Sidecar starts going and it starts taking off, right? And I think that they raised around, $10 million in financing or something like that. And we had just raised a $6 million A with Mayfield. And at the time, I remember there was a lot of paranoia about the competition and this kind of concept that short distance liquidity was actually the way to grow. And Sidecar became so supply constrained.
Right, like high utilization, short distances.
Yeah, so quickly. It was also against the law. That was the other thing. It was like, it was true, like, for lack of a better term, gypsy cab, right? Like that was how it was working. So at the time, we were paying attention to that. I don't know how much Uber was paying attention to it. Uber had recently launched UberX, which was still professional drivers, but in more or less like Priuses, who were using, and Camry, like slightly lower end cars at lower prices. And they were starting to see the impact of, they already had that concept, but lowering their price and the interesting liquidity in the rideshare market, where the market is so sensitive to pricing.
Yep.
So we had a hackathon. We had two ideas that were kind of the finalists in the hackathon. One was to create an app that said, "Hey, Zach, I'm on my way to your house. I'm going to share my location with you so you can see my tracking." I thought we should do that idea. And then John and Logan and most other people thought we should do this idea, which was a female driver, female passenger only version of Sidecar, which didn't have a name, but it would be pink and it would be kind of out there. And that's the origin of the beginnings of Lyft. We put 3 people on it, Harrison Bowden, who was an intern and designer, Sebastian, who was a mobile app developer, and then I think Evan, who's the founder of a company called Parkade, was the product manager we brought in a little bit later. And then we had 1 or 2 engineers. I don't remember which engineers were working on it. And John and Logan, trying to figure this out. And over 6-8 weeks, they built the first version of what became Lyft. And my job was to find drivers. So it was my job on Zimride to find drivers. And I had to go post on Craigslist and interview and bring drivers in. And we found that we couldn't find all the female drivers. There just wasn't enough supply. So we expanded it, but the pink mustaches, which Lyft was famous for in the beginning, were actually taken from our Zimride enterprise business, where we would give these car stashes away. This guy, Ethan Eiler, created these car stashes. And those were our giveaways for people that you could put on your grill at these conferences.
Yeah, I remember when first starting to hear about Lyft, and it was this like quirky, wacky pink mustache thing, and I remember thinking to myself, like, look, you gotta find press somehow, and if that's the way they find press, why not?
Yeah, brilliant move by John, because when you put,
it was so recognizable. It was so recognizable.
Yeah, we opened right around Memorial Day of 2012, and when you had a bunch of cars driving around the city with pink mustaches on them in San Francisco, especially, it's 7x7, but the most folks are working in, call it a 3x3. So you start seeing these cars with these pink mustaches on the front with a high level of frequency. And we started going, and after, a couple months, it was like this thing was growing at 25% a week. And we couldn't keep up with and what did we do? We dropped prices. The price instead of $25, $30 was $10 to get from, North Beach down to the office in Soma, right? Or the marina to Soma or the Mission, which is where people worked.
So this is 2012. You're like barely a year, or maybe not even a year out of college at this point.
I'm a year out of college. Yeah, I'm a year out of college, right? So
and sorry, and just give me have Logan and John at this point decided we're pivoting the business, or are you still running Zimride? Has the Lyft name launched? Like where are they just like, this is like something we should test, or is this like we've moved the team over to this?
This is a test.
Okay.
So we enter the summer of 2012, and it becomes apparent that we've done a ton of work on kind of redesigning Zimride into this Zimride Instant, which was based on Airbnb added instant book. On Airbnb, if you recall, you used to only be able to book and then message, and then you had to get accepted, and then you could instantly book. So we had challenges with drivers going, back and forth. So we've done this whole redesign, and we were ready to put all of our resources behind this Zimride thing. But Lyft just started taking off. And John and Logan, I think, looked at each other, and I wasn't in the room, obviously, for all the conversations, but I remember the moment where they shifted the entire company, except for 2 of our early employees, to focus on Lyft. And I think pushed to some extent by the investors and the VC interest and just the numbers. It was like, we need to make this move. And, for lack of a better term, the rest is history.
Right.
But that moment was a moment in opportunism that we saw, and they ended up selling the Zimride business, I think about a year later, to Enterprise Rental Car. And there was some value there, but Zimride would never have been, it never would have been, really anything.
Right.
Maybe they would have sold it for $10 million.
Thank God for that decision, because then you would have been, it would have been nothing. It would have been grasping for straws at that business while you watched everyone that was your peer sort of sprint ahead.
That's right. And the summer of 2012, Uber made the decision as well to move from kind of Uber X being these TLC or licensed drivers, depending on the state. I think each state has a different acronym for it, but licensed drivers to, we're going to look at this Sidecar Lyft model. We're
gig economy,
right
at the very beginnings of the gig economy stuff. Yeah.
And we're going to open San Francisco, or opening LA, and then, and then off to the races, where they had 17 offices around the country and applied the same playbook, and then both out capitalized and out executed, and figured out a couple of the early most important dynamics that you needed for marketplace liquidity. Specifically kind of driver hours and driver hours at peak time, and surge pricing was actually hugely strategic, where we said, we don't want that. They leaned into it, and there's another podcast, but kind of the early history of how Uber ended up leapfrogging the rest of the competition and really outfoxing Lyft in the early days, and kind of putting us behind because of the scale and capability that they were just ahead. So it was, again, an example of Uber totally pivoted their business from this black car to another version of it, because they saw the opportunity, they saw what competition was doing. Right. And again, when we move in a moment to kind of the Candid pivot story, it looks very different. Those are examples of, I would call, opportunistic pivots, where you see an opportunity, your current business is working, but maybe not going to be at crazy scale. And you go, hey, if we move into this, we have a strategic advantage. Right. And again, that's where Uber kind of ended up leapfrogging everybody, and it's 150.
The funny / sad side note to this is that Sidecar got leapfrogged by both of you, and Sidecar never went anywhere, right? I remember when I was at IEC doing acquisitions, they tried to sell themselves to us. This is probably circa 2013, 2014, maybe 2015. It was over for them by that point. They were an afterthought.
Yeah, they messed up the marketplace dynamics, and they tried to grow too quickly. And whereas Uber already had the resources and the capabilities to drive that growth and the tenacity to make it happen, just the competitive intensity that existed inside that company, Sidecar had to kind of build the infrastructure before they got to that level of scale. And they, like many Silicon Valley companies, believed that that first mover advantage was critical. And so they overscaled way too quickly and just got over their skis and ended up not making it.
All right, cool. That's an amazing like little side journey. Well, it's important to your journey, right? So you were there for a number of years, right? And then what led you from there to start Candid?